Today on Sports Around the Bar, we're going to be fixing the Detroit Lions for 2020. We're going to hopefully be taking a team that went 3-12-1 in the regular season this year in 2019 and turning them into a playoff caliber team with just a couple small moves going into 2020. Without further ado, let's get started. There's a couple things you need to know about this team, and that is that they're 17th in cap space right now. They have $46 million in free cap space after re-signing Danny Amendola, a move we're going to talk about in a little bit here. The other thing I want you to know and to keep in mind is this is a team that out of its 16 games, 12 of them finished within one score of their opponents. So Detroit is a team that, even though on paper they look like they're a bad squad, at 3-12, they are still a group that is not far away from winning a lot of games in the National Football League, despite playing in one of the toughest divisions in football in the NFC North right now. So to fix this team, first what we need to do is we need to look at what we have on offense, and we're going to go through all those positions really quick. We're going to go with our own free agents, addressing how we can bring back the right guys and let go of the wrong ones, hopefully to improve into 2020. It starts with the quarterback position. There are rumors out there that the Lions are considering trading Matt Stafford away for I don't know what, but you have a 32-year-old quarterback, and let me just say this before we go too much farther into it. This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Trading a 32-year-old quarterback who's just now going into the apex of his career where he's going to be playing his best football. He's got the experience and still has the body to keep up with the rigors and the demands of the National Football League on a day-to-day basis. Getting rid of him, a guy that threw in 8 games, 2,500 yards, 19 touchdowns to only 5 interceptions, absolutely ridiculous. I think that I don't know how much truth there is to these rumors, but I've heard them swirling around and around and around for months now. But even during the season, there was talk that they might be moving on from Matt Stafford when things weren't going well and considering drafting a rookie quarterback instead. Absolutely wrong move. Right now, with pick 3 in the draft, what we need to do simply is retain Matt Stafford, who's had one of his career years going into 2020 and hopefully beyond. He's the kind of guy that if you build the right team around him, we could win a Super Bowl, even in Detroit, as ridiculous as that sounds. We can make it happen in Detroit if Matt Stafford's our quarterback. Let's address backup quarterback really quick. We have Jeff Driscoll and David Blau on the roster. David Blau is still under contract. He's a younger talent than Jeff Driscoll. He played better per se. I mean, neither one was exactly spectacular. Jeff Driscoll's come up big in the past couple of years from the backup standpoint, but not really the kind of guy that's going to come in reliably and win you games as a backup. He's not really a good relief pitcher. We're going to let him go. We're going to go with David Blau and maybe try to draft a real late-round quarterback, maybe try to sign an undrafted free agent to go as our third kind of practice squad quarterback. We just don't need to pay Jeff Driscoll to come back as our backup, and we already have David Blau. So we're going to let Jeff Driscoll walk, and we're going to move on to halfback. Now, halfback is an interesting position for the Detroit Lions because they actually have a lot of talent on the roster right now in guys like Kerryon Johnson. Bo Scarborough came in when he got hurt this year and had a pretty good year, good bounce back coming from Dallas. You have J.D. McKissick, who looked very good in very limited snaps. You even have a guy like Ty Johnson that even though he didn't impress, he's young enough that we are willing to give him another shot to develop in this offense. We're good. We have 4 guys that are reliable on the top. We've got Wes Hills and Trey Carson behind them that are speculative pieces but may eventually develop into something. We are stacked at running back. We have this position secure for the future going forward. So we're not going to make any moves there. We don't have anyone coming up on contract. We have everybody locked down. We have everybody ready to go. And we have enough talent that we can lean into this in 2020 and try to take a little bit of the weight off of Matt Stafford's shoulders. That's been the game plan pretty much since they've drafted Kerryon Johnson, is to get more invested in the running game so that Matt Stafford's not having to throw 60 times and beat everybody with his arm every single game. I like that approach, and I think we're going to try to rely on that in 2020 going forward. Next, let's talk receivers. We have 2 great outside receivers in Kenny Golladay and Marvin Jones. Kenny Golladay is a budding star. He's obviously going to be fantastic. We're excited to have him back and growing with Matt Stafford, an experienced guy who's been able to maximize his talent to this point. And then we have Marvin Jones, experienced veteran. He's able to take the top off of defense and still has that explosive playability. We like him as well. A couple days ago, we re-signed Danny Amendola for the slot. We have a great 1-2-3 punch at wide receiver, and I think that's a big reason why Matt Stafford threw for almost 2,500 yards. We are experienced here. We have guys that have been in the league for at least a couple of years now. The only kind of weakness I can say at the wide receiving group is maybe our depth isn't as good. Guys like Travis Fulgham, guys like Chris Lacey haven't really lived up to their expectations yet. But we also have Marvin Hall, who has shown a little bit of shine, and a guy that I'm excited to develop as our depth wide receiver. We're going to let Jermaine Kearse go, the only wide receiver that's actually up on contract here. Danny Amendola is returning since they've already re-signed him, so we're not going to address that. This is a position that I think we could get better at in the draft, especially when we're talking about the third and the fourth round with as deep as it is at wide receiver. We're going to keep that in mind as we go into it because Danny Amendola is 34, a slot receiver that can come in and learn behind him would be a great pickup for Detroit going forward as a team. Next, we'll shift over to offensive line. This is another group that, again, fantastic results. We've got mostly the entire group returning. The only guy who's actually up on contract is our right guard in Graham Glasgow. The rest of the group, Ricky Wagner, Frank Ragnow, Joe Dahl, and Taylor Decker, they've all been anywhere between absolutely elite and Taylor Decker to somewhere a little bit above average, somewhere around average in Joe Dahl and Ricky Wagner. But we still have got good play out of this unit as a whole. Our entire objective, much like the Redskins, is just keep this group together to protect Matt Stafford and try to establish the run. We might try to address it in free agency if we get a sweetheart of a deal and we see a huge upgrade, but for the most part, these guys need to come back. The chemistry needs to stay there, and we need to keep these guys playing together so that we can lean on the running game and we can protect Matt Stafford better in 2020 instead of just trying to shuffle the deck for its own sake. Okay. So with Graham Glasgow up on contract, what we need to offer him is a 4-year, $42 million contract. That's going to be $30 million of that guaranteed. That's going to keep him here through his 32-year-old season. It's the best way to lock him up. We're going to go and ensure that for the next 3 to 4 years, he's going to be well paid, he's going to stay in Detroit, and he's going to be protecting Matt Stafford and hopefully giving us a good kind of anchor on the right side to run off with Kerryon Johnson. That's the strong side of the offensive line. We're going to be running over there more often than not. Bringing him back is absolutely critical here because we don't want to go into this draft with our offensive line kind of up in the air when we already know that Graham Glasgow can get it done in the kind of offense that we want to run. Just as another side note for our depth, we are going to re-sign Oday Abushi. He's a backup, somewhere around average. We didn't see great play out of him, but again, keeping the band together is exactly what we need to do on this offense. Aside from Jeff Driscoll and Jermaine Kearse, pretty much everybody on this offense is going to be returning in 2020, and I think that's going to pay dividends when we talk about Matt Stafford hopefully coming back healthy in 2020 after he got shut down with a back injury in the middle of 2019. So we're going to offer Abushi a 1-year, $1.5 million contract. $500,000 of that's going to be guaranteed. That's just, like I said, to keep our depth kind of in place. If he decides he wants more, we can let him walk, and we can always replace him with another guy in free agency. That'll be a late signing or maybe someone we go address after the draft. But as long as it's there's no reason why we can't have him come back. We've got good play out of him, and I don't see him moving on to be a starter for somebody else, but you never know. He might try to test free agency, and some team might pick him up. If he walks, he walks. If not, the only one that's absolutely important is Graham Glasgow returning. Now, Detroit's good at tight end. They have both Jesse James and TJ Hockenson. TJ Hockenson is hopefully going to take that next step forward as a prospect after we spent that top 10 pick on him. We didn't get a ton of returns when we talk about him only having somewhere in the 300 receiving yard range, but tight end is a developmental position in the NFL. We're going to give it a couple years and reserve judgment, but for right now, with Jesse James, with TJ Hockenson, we're going to stand pat at tight end and just count on Hockenson taking that next step forward and hopefully becoming the guy that we all compared him to, which is Rob Gronkowski. I don't see that really happening in 1 year, but hopefully he takes a step closer to that elite level of play instead of remaining where he is. I think he should develop. Now we need to talk about the defensive side of the ball because this group has been one of the most confusing ones in football. Let's talk about the defensive end position first, but this goes along the entire defensive line. It goes into our linebackers as well. We've had a bunch of guys on this defense that have played really, really well in the past, and just with this new Matt Patricia defense have not translated into the scheme. So we have a major question to ask ourselves, and that is, do these guys simply not fit our scheme, and do they need to move on because of it? Or is this just a learning gap? Is this something where another year in the system we can get closer to that production we saw in 2018 out of a lot of these guys like Deshaun Hand, guys on the defensive interior like Ashawn Robinson and Mike Daniels, guys from our linebacker position like Jared Davis? We saw so much decline of our entire defense that we could just chalk it up to it being schematic and it being one of those situations where we just need more time with our players. The good news is most of these guys are under contract. Our defensive tackle position is definitely the one where we have the most free agents, but Romeo Okwara and Trey Flowers, both of the guys listed as our starters, but Deshaun Hand, who I think should be the starter as well. I think we have all of these guys coming back, and that is a strength for the Detroit Lions. I'm all in favor for giving them another shot here. We might try to buff up the position, bring in another guy or two to just encourage some competition and make sure that we're getting good returns on what we have. But for the most part, bringing all of these guys back is not a negative. Aside from Trey Flowers, nobody really excelled in this defense. Maybe you could say Mike Daniels did before he got hurt, but he barely played this season. I think Trey Flowers, aside from his experience in New England working with Matt Patricia, has been the best player on this defensive front. We need more guys than just that to step up. Let's shift over to defensive tackle. We're not making any moves at defensive end. Most of those kind of edge rushers are going to be too expensive for us to try to afford anyway. Now that we're down around $35 million in cap, what we're going to do instead is talk about our defensive tackles. Damian Harrison is our starter who remains under contract. Even though he didn't have as good of a year, he has been very good in the past. We're going to rely on him going forward. We're also going to try to renew both A'Shawn Robinson and Mike Daniels, guys that struggled, but guys that in 2020 hopefully develop into this system. They kind of learn what they need to do, where they need to be in Matt Patricia's group, and hopefully we get closer to those 2018 numbers. There's just too much talent to let walk here. It's that simple. We can't let guys that are this good walk out and hit the street where someone else can sign them, especially in division. I mean, the last thing we want is one of these guys to go to the Bears or the Packers, especially the Packers with our interiors guys. What we need to do, bring them back, offer them another chance. I don't know that Detroit's going to be able to do it. I think a couple of these guys might want simply out of Detroit because of how poorly they performed, but we're going to try to renew them, and we're going to assume for this analysis that they're interested in re-signing with Detroit. It starts with A'Shawn Robinson. I mean, this guy in 2018, one of the best defensive tackles in the NFL. And then we go into 2019 with this new defense, and he's subpar. He can't really seem to find himself. Doesn't do very well. Him and Mike Daniels, both guys that the past couple of years have absolutely excelled in the NFL. This year have taken a step back. We're going to offer them both contracts. Mike Daniels at almost 31. We're going to give him a 2-year, $8 million contract. We're going to be guaranteed $5 million of that and front load it. So that way, should his play just fall off due to age, we can walk away from him without much of an expense. As for A'Shawn Robinson, he's like the exact flip of the coin on that. When we talk about him, he's 25. He's a guy that we should want long-term. So we're going to offer him a 4-year, $12 million contract. There's a very good chance that he doesn't want to sign for that little money for that long. He might wind up signing on a prove-it deal. If we offer him somewhere around that $3 million mark, I think that's important to bring him back. We want him on a prove-it deal so that we can see, hey, 2019 just wasn't your year. 2018 is the player you actually are. We just can't afford to overpay him. There's a chance he hits the open market. There's a chance that somebody just breaks the bank to bring him back. If that's the case, we got to let him go, kind of like a couple of these other players in this roster. But as long as we have the opportunity to, and we can sign him to somewhere around that $3 million mark, maybe up to $4 million, that's the best thing for the Detroit Lions. We need to figure out if this guy can replicate his 2018 season again. Now, we still have Damian Harrison on the roster. He's going to stay here. We're going to bring back the big three at D-tackle, and hopefully that gives us a depth and rotation that in 2020 responds better. I don't really see us having a ton of opportunities to address D-tackle. We might be able to spend a draft pick or two on the defensive line, but for the most part, we're going to roll into 2020 with much of the same roster because these guys have all done it before. We just need to bring that talent back out of them and execute a defense that maximizes their potential. Next, let's talk about our underachieving linebackers. Aside from Devin Kennard, we do not have a guy that absolutely stood out here. Even though we have Jared Davis on the roster, who in 2018 looked like one of the best run-defending linebackers in football under this Matt Patricia defense. I know you're getting tired of me saying it. I'm getting tired of saying it myself. Wasn't the same guy. He was a guy that went from 100 tackles down to 63. I know he played 5 fewer games, but still, the opportunities were there. He just did not have as good of a year, especially in pass coverage. The guy could not cover anybody. We need to go into free agency to address this position specifically on the defense. We need to bring in a coverage linebacker that can kind of complement Jared Davis, complement Devin Kennard, and really just reinforce the middle of the field because that was where the easiest place to attack the Detroit Lions was in 2019. That's going to be our main target in free agency. We'll get to that in just a minute. For now, again, we have a lot of guys returning, but we don't have a lot of faith in any of them. Jalen Reeves-Maben was below average. Jelani Tavai, for a rookie season, did okay. I don't know that he's ready to step up and be an every down linebacker. I don't know that he's ready to step up and be a starter or even a 2-down linebacker where we have him in there on the short on running downs. We need instead to bring in a pass coverage linebacker in free agency to basically replace Christian Jones because after the year he had in 2019, it's about time we moved on from him. or at the very least shifted him back into a more rotational role in our linebacking core. None of our guys are up on contract again. This might be another situation where we stand pat, but we did not get good linebacker play out of anybody in this defense. It's time that we address that, and it's time that we bring in a guy that can shut down the middle of the field and kind of match up one-on-one with opponents' tight ends. Moving on to quarterback, we have Darius Slay. Beyond that, we have just a bunch of guys. Rashad Melvin's the only one up on contract. We are not going to offer him a contract as long as we keep Darius Slay, but rumor has it Detroit's talking about trading Darius Slay as well. I think that's the opposite of what we need to do. Again, I don't think this team's far off of winning. I think we need to instead offer Darius Slay a new 3-year extension worth $38 million. 24 of that's going to be guaranteed. That'll keep him here through the rest of his career. He's more than likely going to retire a Detroit Lion. This guy's been one of the most influential players in our secondary for years now. It's time that we get him some help. We're going to do that in the draft. Spoiler alert for later ahead. We're going to get him some help in this draft that's going to be able to match up on the outside, and we're going to rely on the defensive line playing better to help our secondary. Now, we have good safety play behind him. We have Tracy Walker. We have Tavon Wilson. We do need to bring Tavon Wilson back on contract. Both those guys were above average. They were both good players. They're guys that we can rely on in the secondary. Now, Tavon Wilson is 30, and he's going to be 30 in the 2020 season, so we're not going to offer him a long contract, but we are going to give him a 2-year, $4 million contract to try to make sure he sticks around in Detroit. It's almost going to be a stopgap until we have the time and the ability to spend some picks on safety. Right now, we have a lot of other needs. I don't know that we're going to be able to get around to addressing safety at this point, so we're going to bring him back, rely on him for the next year or two, and hopefully we get similar play for about that length of time. Moving into our free agent targets, there's one position, and one position alone we should actually target in free agency. I know it'll be tempting to go after one of these cornerbacks. It'll be tempting to go after a safety or another receiver. But instead, what we need to do is open the wallet and sign a young linebacker that can cover the pass over the middle for years to come for us. There's two major targets we need to talk about. That's Joe Schobert and Blake Martinez. Both of those guys I think we need to target at the same time. We're going to go after Schobert first, even though he's a couple years older than Martinez. He is still the much better pass defender. He's basically elite at it, even though he struggles a little bit in run defense. Scary for a linebacker, I know. We're going to pair him next to Jared Davis, who's great at that. We're going to count on that pairing being one of our best kind of features on our defense going forward. We're going to offer Schobert a 4-year, $44 million contract. We're going to guarantee 30 of it. He's an amazing coverage guy from Cleveland that we're going to count on shutting down the middle of the field for us. If we do miss on him, Blake Martinez is more of an all-around guy. He's covered the pass well. He's covered the run well. He doesn't quite have that elite athleticism, which should we ever get to the point where we're trying to win a Super Bowl, you're going to need that to cover a lot of these top-end tight ends because those teams tend to be good. Guys like Zach Ertz, guys like George Kittle, guys like Travis Kelce. We need a guy who's going to be more athletic than Blake Martinez is to cover them long-term. That's why we're not as crazy about that signing. But let's say we miss Joe Schobert. Instead, we're going to go after Blake Martinez. He's going to be that next best guy that we're going to ask to cover those tight ends. We're going to give him a 4-year, $36 million contract, 21 guaranteed. Again, Blake Martinez is still a second pick, but he's not that far off of Schobert that we're going to be too disappointed. If we do miss on those two guys, we do need to bring in a cheaper veteran that's going to be a stopgap at that position until we're able to spend a draft pick on it. Guys like Josh Bynes and Danny Trevathan are both on our radar for it. Trevathan, we're going to offer a 2-year, $3 million contract. Same thing to Josh Bynes. Those guys are going to be the Band-Aid that keeps this defense afloat for 2020 and competitive. It's still a position we're going to have to address, but it won't be something we'll be able to do in the rest of this offseason. Those are the guys that if we miss the two younger kind of stud linebackers up there, we're going to sign them as the disaster plan. Finally, let's talk about the draft. Obviously, we already talked about it a little bit already, but with the 3rd overall pick, our first thing we should absolutely do is try to trade it. If we can find a team that wants to trade up for Tua Tagovailoa, I believe this is the most likely landing spot for that to happen. Everybody knows Washington is not going to be drafting a quarterback. They know that the Giants behind us are not drafting a quarterback. We are kind of the only question mark. With Chase Young on the board and as talented as he is, I don't see the Redskins trading their pick very easily. We are the first spot a team can truly trade up to, and I think that's very likely to happen. If we can get multiple first-round picks, that is the best play to fix the Detroit Lions going forward for years to come. Let's assume, for argument's sake, someone trades with the Giants, or nobody wants to trade with us. The Dolphins choose to stand pat at 5 and try to get their guy. The Chargers do the same at 6. let's just assume we don't get a trade. In that case, we're drafting Jeff Okudah. He's going to be our next Darius Slay type cornerback that we can put on the outside and we can rely on him for years to come. He's a guy that it's a no-brainer to me. I know there's people talking about Isaiah Simmons. I know I said I needed a coverage guy, and that would be an absolutely fantastic pick as well. I wouldn't hate that either. I think Isaiah Simmons is a great prospect. He's probably the third or fourth best defender on my entire big board in this entire draft. But one thing I will say about the difference between linebacker and corner is we can go sign a linebacker right now that's going to be our linebacker for years to come. There's not really a corner out there that I look at and say, I can just sign him and we're getting a top 5, top 10 player at the position like we could be getting with Schobert or Martinez. Instead, what we're going to do is draft Jeff Okudah because he can eventually turn into that top 5 potential guy, and we're going to sign a linebacker because that's what makes the most sense to getting the most elite defense as humanly possible. Now, if we miss on linebacker, let's say we don't get any of those guys, the decision's absolutely up there. We could change our minds and go with Isaiah Simmons, but we're going to assume that we did get to sign one of those top-tier linebackers, and we're going to draft Jeff Okudah with pick number 1. Now, pick 2, we're going to bring in another defensive end because our edge rush is absolutely paramount. We have a young corner in Okudah coming in. We have Darius Slay, but behind that, we don't have a whole lot of talent at the cornerback position. So the best way to hide that and cover it up is to get the best players we can to rush the passer. We're going to draft Curtis Weaver, edge rusher from Boise State. Now, this guy very well could be gone before the second round. He's got a lot of question marks. He doesn't look as the part as some of the other defensive ends do in this class. There's a lot of guys like Clavion Chason and Yetur Gross-Matos that look more like your prototypical edge rushers. But this guy has been absolutely insanely productive in college. We need to draft him, bring him in. Don't worry about the way he looks. Worry about what he does in the field. We're going to put him at defensive end and let him compete in that group. Hopefully, he can be that guy that establishes himself next to Trey Flowers. But if not, we have another good rotational piece that hopefully will fit this defensive group better than we've seen some of these other guys do in recent years. After that, the third round, again, just like always, once we get past round 2, we're going to talk more about positions of need as opposed to actual guys. There's just no way to predict who's going to be there and who isn't, so we're going to talk about positions instead. We're going to draft a wide receiver. We're looking for a Danny Amendola replacement because he has been critical in the slot for this team. I think with the 2 outside threats we have in Kenny Golladay and Marvin Jones, bringing in another slot receiver that could eventually pick up the mantle from Danny Amendola would be huge. Now, round 4, we're going to go for interior defensive line. We're going to look for a D tackle that can come in and hopefully be a long-term replacement for someone like Mike Daniels. We also had a lot of disappointing performances from guys like A'Shawn Robinson and Mike Daniels. This is going to be the guy that if we put out there can develop in Matt Patricia's defense. He's the guy we get to pick. He's the guy that we know will fit what we want to do because we're drafting him. It's just an insurance pick at this point, but if there is a solid defensive tackle out there, it's a position that we should draft right now. Moving on from that, we're going to draft a tight end in the 5th round and an offensive lineman in the 6th. The tight end is purely for depth. Depth means Jesse James, is an adequate tight end, but he's not necessarily a great one. We're going to just take a speculative pick and see if we can get somebody that eventually evolves into a better player than that. As for offensive line, we're just doing it purely for depth's sake. We're going to draft one, see what happens. Again, we're not married to that spot, but with our strength being in the offensive side of the ball, we're going to try to continue that by drafting another late-round offensive lineman and seeing if we can develop him. All right, guys, that's going to do it for the Detroit Lions. Let me know what you liked about this, what you didn't like about it. As always, Sports Around the Bar, we're here doing videos every day. Hit that subscribe button so you can join in and talk sports with us, because that's why we do what we do. We love talking sports with you guys. Hopefully, this group can turn it around in 2020, because when we're talking about the Detroit Lions, this is a group that we expected big things in 2018 when we saw what the defensive line looked like, when we saw what Jarrett Davis was able to do, when we know what Matt Stafford's able to do. They absolutely underperformed in 2019. Hopefully 2020, they add a linebacker, they draft well, and we're talking about this group just rebounding and becoming the force that it could be in the NFC North.